The short answer is you can't. So the right to food is part of the bundle of rights we have under the economic, social and cultural rights, part of the human rights framework. And the UK is a signatory to that, but it's never been brought into UK law, so that it can't really be enforced effectively in the UK. Scotland has devolved authority of Scottish Parliament over human rights as part of the 1998 Scotland Act. So the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament are able to bring the economic, social and cultural rights into Scots law when they decide to do that. And broadly speaking, they've made a commitment to do that in the next Parliament through a new Human Rights Act. Government then becomes a duty bearer, and it has a duty to ensure that these rights are met. And citizens become rights holders, and they have the power to hold government to account for delivering on those rights. Now, the way that economic, social and cultural rights works is different from the way that civil and political rights work, in the sense that it's more of a collective right, and it's more of a right which governments have a duty to enforce over time. So if you have a right, not to be tortured, that applies now. It's not like, you have a right not to be tortured as much as used to be tortured. But with the economic, social, cultural rights, the enforcement arrangement is slightly different. And essentially, governments have a right. They have to respect, protect, and fulfill that right. And they have to do that progressively over time, not go backwards on that right. And they have to do it, to the maximum use of available resources. So it's not a defense to say, well, we decided not to spend any money on that. We're going to spend money on something else. But it is a defense to say, we're making progress on this. We're spending more money on it than we used to. We're spending more money than any other country in the world on it, or whatever it is, to say, we're doing our best on this. So it's a slightly different way that rights are enforced under legislation. But at the moment, as I say, in the UK, you can't really take the government. There's not any obvious way you could take the government to court or to judicial review about your own right to food and say that it's not being met. You've seen considerable divergence, obviously, between the UK and Scottish government over the extent to which they see human rights as a helpful part of the, if you like, the social contract between citizens and the government. Scottish government, particularly under the leadership of the current First Minister, has been very committed to strengthening and extending human rights in Scotland, and sees that as an important part of how government relates to its citizens. Now, there's always, delays, and the reality inevitably always fall short of the rhetoric. But lots of things have been put in place in Scotland to progress human rights and to engage civil society in that, and to make sure that human rights are weaved into the framework of the Scottish Parliament, into the fabric of the Scottish Parliament. Obviously, there's a different discourse going on in England, and particularly part of the Brexit discourse was around getting away from these institutions. And I think there was some confusion during the Brexit conversation that somehow leaving the EU meant leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, which of course it doesn't. So we're still very much under that. But the talk about a British Bill of Rights and trying to create our own framework for rights, I think, is code for, we don't want to be part of this international system in quite the same way as we have been up till now. And the UK has played such an important part in the international human rights system over the years. It's very distressing that this sort of dissing of human rights by prominent politicians in the UK has just been accepted as being part of who we are. It's not part of who we are in the UK, and it never has been. But the fact remains that there's a divergence at the moment between the governments in Westminster and Holyrood on the question of human rights. And while we would love to see the right to food being part of UK law and not just Scots law, the reality is that it will become part of Scots law in the foreseeable future, and not part of UK law under the present government. Well, there's many ways in which it shouldn't have come to this. The UK government should have been smart enough to realise that it was going to lose in the court of public opinion on this. That what COVID has changed, among many other things, is a public realization that losing your job, suddenly overnight becoming poor, not being able to afford the things you're able to afford, including food, is an experience which, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have suddenly had during COVID, when their livelihoods have disappeared overnight. And so I think that idea that somehow people have only themselves to blame for having to go to a food bank, I think people have, you know, the tide has completely shifted on that, and people think, look, you know, this has happened to people by forces outside their control, and you know, it's simply not fair to have a society where the consequence of losing your job overnight is that you become destitute, and that's not the sort of country we want to live in. So I think the idea that it's okay for children to go out without food in the holidays because their parents have become unemployed is just not, people don't buy that anymore. And Marcus Rashford, you know, was very good at spotting, you know, committing. I mean, it's not, he didn't spot an opportunity. I think what he did was say, I've had this experience, I don't think it should happen to other people, and I'm going to use my personal and political capital to make sure it doesn't happen. So it was a mistake in the sense that government should have seen that coming, but it's also a mistake in that, you know, we shouldn't have got into this position, as you say, from the very outset of the pandemic. We should have been thinking, how do we make sure that the economic turmoil that this is going to create doesn't result in destitution, misery, doesn't increase the need for food banks, because this was completely predictable and completely avoidable. And then, I mean, if you look just in purely monetary terms at the sort of money which it would take to, you know, at the very least provide, you know, the money for free school meals was minute compared to the amount of money invested in trying to keep the economy afloat. The amount of money that it would cost to replace all the food in food banks with supermarket vouchers or cash, you know, it's minute. I mean, it's tiny in public expenditure terms. So food banks and these charitable approaches to food, you know, are a sort of wonderful expression of solidarity. You know, people saying this shouldn't happen. We want to go out and make sure that people can get enough to eat. But in monetary terms, in public policy terms, you know, they really don't substitute for a rights-based approach to food or to a decent standard of living. You know, and we got into a position where we were trying to safeguard a lot of jobs, a lot of livelihoods, a lot of businesses. But what we didn't do was reform some of the structures which actually pushed people into destitution. So if you look at the Trussell Trust figures on the level of debt that people have when they go to food banks, it's staggering to see that a large proportion of that debt is with the government. This isn't money to doorstep lenders. This is money that people owe to the government, and that 30 or 40% of their entitlement, their social security, is being taken away to pay the government back, and that's leaving them in destitution. Now, under any version of human rights, a government that is making its citizens destitute by forcing them to repay loans that they can't afford to repay is not upholding those rights. It's not upholding people's economic, social, and cultural rights. You know, and therefore, if the right to food was in UK law at the moment, it would be possible to take judicial review against the Department of Work and Pensions for the way it reclaims money from people's incomes, because it's not respecting and it's not protecting the right to food. But more generally, we don't think that any form of food aid at the end of the day is dignified. You know, it's not dignified for people to have to choose secondhand food that's come out the back of the supermarket because that's all they can afford. You know, even if it's, I don't want to name a particular brand, but you know, if it's custard creams, you know, but that's what there is, then that's what you get. If it's this sliced bread that you never normally eat, that's what you get. That's all you can afford. That's not dignified. It's not acceptable in our culture that you simply have to eat whatever calories are given to you. So we'd like to move towards a situation where nobody has to go to a food project. Nobody goes to a food project because they have to go there. If we have community food projects, they're places people want to go. They're places people want to go because they get to, cook with other people. They get to share in a community garden. They get to, socialize with people, and maybe they set up a co-op and buy veg together or buy rice together or buy, but they're not places they have to go because they don't have any choice. So ultimately for us, a dignified approach to food provision is you go to the shops like everybody else, you buy what you want like everybody else, that's a dignified approach. There would be no food banks. There would be no, the alternative ways of buying food would be ones which were, as I said, ones that people had chosen to set up. Yeah. So sure, if you want to set up a community shop, and run the community shop, that's great. But you shouldn't have to set up a community shop, because there's no other way that your community can afford to buy food,
Yeah. And again, so having looked at it from that perspective, the proliferation of food banks this year would suggest that we're not getting closer to our right to food. We're actually getting further away from it in some ways.
We're getting further away from it. And what I want to stress is that the right to food is not just about access. So what the right to food includes is health. The food has to be healthy. It has to be sustainable. Part of the way the right to food is set out by the UN is about making sure that this right doesn't compromise future generations' right to food. So the right to food includes an element of sustainability, making sure that the systems which produce it are sustainable. And it also includes a very strong sense of culturally acceptable. People have a right to food that is right for them in their culture. And, sometimes when people say, well, if people would only, get a bone and, stew it for 6 hours and then add some turnips, they could eat perfectly well, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what this is about, this is about people being able to participate in a food culture that's, desirable, that's appropriate, that's culturally makes sense to people. It's about participation, it's about enjoyment, it's about, if you like, sharing what the earth has to offer people. We live in a world where, so much food is wasted. We're completely capable of producing enough nourishing food on the planet to feed everybody now and into the future. This is not a technical problem. There's more than enough food to go around, and there's more than enough good food to go around. But we're failing. The food system is failing to meet people's needs. And then when we try to patch it with these sort of weird solutions about, trying to solve the problem of poverty by redirecting surplus food to people, it doesn't solve the problem. All it does is maintain a dysfunctional system. I think it's probably fair to say that certainly some of the bigger food manufacturers have moved a long way on this in the last few years. They've woken up to the unsustainability of the food system, and not least because they have to be thinking 10 or 20 years ahead in terms of supply chains and the current way that the terms of trade for farming just mean that a lot of people don't want to do it anymore. They also see that we're losing land, we're losing soil, we're messing the climate up to a terrible extent, we're losing species, we're simply frittering away the Earth's natural capital in a way that's just astonishing. They're only in the black because we don't count those things. If we were counting those things,
it's a false economy.
Then they'd be in the red. Shareholders pull their money out. Economic model of treating the environment as an externality, which is so 19th century. We're in the 21st century. It's very hard for food businesses to incorporate those externalities on their balance sheet if it's not a law that you have to do that, because why would one company do it and not the other? So that whole difficulty about, it's very hard to move forward without regulation, international agreement, international governance of some of those things for these global companies. but a lot of them would welcome it. If you could get to yes on these agreements, then actually some of the big companies would be quite happy with that, because they're smart enough to be able to operate in that new environment, but they can't go first on it without everybody going. So but it's important to remember that while the private sector clearly has duties, sort of human rights framework, the primary duty bearer is government. So it's for government to organise the food system in a way that delivers on these things. And the guidance is really clear on this. It talks about the means of production, the means of distribution, the marketing of food. All of these things are important. So if you take, the unhealthy food environment, that's also breaching the right to food, because the right to food is about having food that is healthy and accessible and sustainable, and at the moment we have a system which just plays cat and mouse with unhealthy food. We sort of put a labeling ban on here or a marketing ban on there, and it pops up somewhere else, and we just play whack-a-mole with it. Instead of saying, like the EU's done with car manufacturers, it says you can do what you like with your fleet of cars. We don't care. Have three-wheel cars, we don't mind. But if they don't, on average, hit 90 grams per kilometre of CO2 emissions, we're going to fine you so much. We are going to fine you so much. It's going to really hurt. And for Nourish, we think that the same approach should apply to the retail and catering food environment. Simply say, we have dietary goals. We think they could be stronger on the environment, but we have dietary goals on health. If the totality of what you sell to the population doesn't match those goals, then you're going to have to pay for that. Because the consequence of you provide the food environment for the population collectively, half a dozen companies provide the food environment for our population. If the food environment you're providing is making people sick, then you're going to have to change that. You can't simply say it's what our customers want. You have to work to match what you provide with what your customers need to stay healthy, and that's a much more strategic approach to this. And you can get to those sorts of approaches if it's clear that government has a duty in this respect. But if a government can simply say, we're going to leave it to the market, or we're going to nudge the market, but if it doesn't work, don't blame us. We'll blame the consumer, we'll blame the businesses, but we don't blame the government. But the government, the government is the collective expression of the will of the people. And if we decide that we want to be healthy as a population, then it's for the government to make sure that happens. You can only take the government to review or to court if you've got a law that you can say they're breaking.
Okay, so that's where it begins.
I think for us, if the Scottish Government follows through on its commitment to implement the right to food and make itself accountable for delivering on a fair, healthy, sustainable food system in Scotland, then that doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't overnight mean that we'll have no more food poverty or food banks or people, who become ill through their diet, or inequalities, or farm workers being, poorly paid in other countries, or the soil being damaged. All of that won't come to an end when we get the right to food. But you'll actually have a change in the relationship with government saying, we accept responsibility. As your government, it's our job to do our best to get a better food system, and you can hold us accountable for that. And that for us is a big change.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Again, I should know this, so apologies. What's the time frame? What are we looking at in terms of this being enacted?
We've been arguing for the right to food be brought into Scots law for 5 years now, which is short in the life of a campaign, but we'd hoped to have that earlier this year with the Good Food Nation bill, but the bill was held up because of the pandemic. We've got Parliament elections next May, and we're hoping that we'll get a strong manifesto commitment for a Good Food Nation bill. The Scottish Government is keen to not implement the right to food separately, but to put it in as part of a wider human rights law. We're arguing along with a lot of our coalition partners for the Good Food Nation bill to come forward first and to include the right to food. and that can then be wrapped up into the wider human rights bill. We feel we've waited long enough for the right to food, and that there's no good argument for it not to be brought into Scots law as part of a food bill. So whether we win or not, within, we think, 3 or 4 years, the right to food will be in law, and that, it'll take a while before it bites, like with anything. These things don't hit the road immediately, but it will change the conversation.